All right, welcome to the new JFK Show, number 189. We've got the next generation researchers. We're in good hands with these folks here. And if you're wondering what's going to happen, because we're not getting any younger, let's face it, we're going to have to rely on the younger generation of researchers. So we have Lance in-house. So go ahead and finish introducing them there, Dr. Fetzer.
Well, Lance and I and Larry, too, have had interaction before with several presentations in the past. So I'm simply delighted he's here today to give us his research on the deep state and the JFK assassination. Lance.
All right. Hello, everyone watching out there. I'm Lance, as you may have heard from the other two guys. And I'd like to present the founding fathers of the American deep state and the JFK assassination with the generation of researchers in this new JFK show. So think about it. You have a murder that took place almost 70 years ago, yet people are still being killed now because of that murder. But why do we have that happening in the first place? Could it be because the people who killed JFK are still in power today? Well, not the same people, but we do have the same organizations, as you can see from this political cartoons here. The government you elect and the unelected deep state. So there are two main groups behind the assassination, and you will learn today something that has never been publicly announced before. The large bankers were against Kennedy not because of any sort of executive order he signed, but because JFK was slowly learning many different deep secrets of the deep state. They were worried about JFK being so popular with the people that he would tell or share these secrets with the public. If this happened, the power that these groups enjoyed over the people would immediately dissipate. The connection that has not been put together before is this. The Federal Reserve has been put together as a Ponzi scheme to bankrupt the US. Big oil has been put together as a fraud based on a limited supply of gas and oil instead of an unlimited one. So these two frauds have created all of these things: the military-industrial complex, an endless war, organized crime, climate change, global warming. All of these are based on nothing more than the control of people and making them more money. So ever wondered about these things? Why opposites are working with each other? ISIS in the US, organized crime in the FBI, CIA and drug dealers, contract killers and the CIA, all of these and cover-ups, all of them are working with each other. Never mind the differences in those groups, because I would like to say that they are all tools of the deep state. They were all created to control people and could not exist without their counterpart. To prove my point, just ask one question. Ever since George H.W. Bush declared war on drugs, has that problem increased or decreased? This proves most of what is told us is a fraud or a lie. And the deep state is so good that they get the public to do their bidding. The deep state is funded on a fraud. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 would not have passed unless a few people died, and this is where essentially the deep state had most of its power. Now, I'd like to bring up a quote from Charles Lindbergh, in which he said, "This Federal Reserve Act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When President Woodrow Wilson signs the bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized, essentially having the most powerful thing in this country controlling the people and controlling what they want. The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board, and as I'd like to say, the fact that we have this going on, the fact that even Charles Lindbergh has this in his quote, means that they essentially have all the power they need, because if they control the economy, then they control education, then they control the people. But because look at what they did in April 15, 1912. These three men were the main oppositions to the Federal Reserve Bank, but all of them were on the Titanic. So now I'd like to bring up the fact that, did you know the sink of the Titanic led to the creation of the US Federal Reserve? So the novel Futility and 1898 creation of Morgan Robertson detailed the sinking of an unsinkable ship, the largest vessel afloat, named the Titan. 14 years later, with uncanny similarities, the real ship Titanic was recreated. What happened in the novel? The two ships had almost identical names. Both ships were designated unsinkable, and both were touted as the largest ship at sea. Both collided with icebergs in April. Both resulted in many deaths, essentially having all these parallels to the novel. Now I'd like to bring up why this created the Federal Reserve. The fact is, the Benjamin Guggenheim, Isarda Strauss, and the head of Macy's department stores and John Jacob Astor, probably the wealthiest man in the world, were all killed when it sank. Those three men were the main opposition to the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve. By April 1912, all opposition to the Federal Reserve was eliminated, essentially making this possible to pass in the first place. Now, some people may dismiss this completely, but before you do, please look at how the Federal Reserve got started and why it started in the first place, because this actually begins in November 1910. So 6 men have a secret meeting to begin the Federal Reserve. In November 1910, these 6 men, Nelson Aldrich A. Piat Andrew, Henry Davidson, Arthur Shelton, Frank Vanderlip, and Paul Warburg, met at the Jekyll Sky Island Club off the coast of Georgia to write a plan to reform the nation's banking system. The meeting and its purpose were closely guarded secrets, and participants did not admit that the meeting occurred until the 1930s. But the plan written on Jekyll Island laid a foundation for what would eventually be the Federal Reserve System. So now let's look at American banking system before 1913. Like many Americans, these men were concerned with financial panics, which had disrupted economic activity in the United States periodically during the 19th century. Nationwide panics occurred on average every 15 years, and these panics forced financial institutions to suspend operations, triggering long and deep recessions, essentially meaning that the economy at the time and the banking systems were all based on very big risks that the stockbrokers had to do in order to profit. So the results of the meeting before, by the end of their time on Jekyll Island, Aldrich and his colleagues had developed a plan for a Reserve Association of America, a single bank with 15 branches across the country.
Lance, this is absolutely sensational. Larry wants to know if we might have a brief bit of conversation at this point.
Yes.
Yeah, Jim, I gotta say that this is impressive research, and I'm sitting here with my stepson. He's going, "What, the Titanic?" And those 3 gentlemen were on the Titanic, and you've got a new wrinkle to this whole thing, and it's I don't know what you guys think over there, and Lance, you're going a little bit too fast. We got to digest all this stuff. What do you think, Jim?
Yeah. I would have suggested. I just wasn't sure. Lance said he had an hour, and I figured he might mean at that high rate of speed. You're doing a fantastic job, Lance, and we want to appreciate what you're saying. So
yeah.
Manage the time frame. I mean, it's okay with us if we go over a bit, by the way. We don't have to be packaged in 1 hour. But we really like and are very impressed with what you're doing.
Yeah, that's all. I just wanted to say that, if you guys.
And generally, the way it works on this show is we all talk all over each other.
No, I mean, you're seeing the actual beginning of the assassination of JFK right here, half a century prior.
Okay, so let Lance go, and then when he slows down, we'll jump in.
All right.
Okay, go ahead, Lance.
Thank you. So essentially what this meeting concluded on is that Aldrich presented it to the National Monetary Commission in place of the absentee, in which in January 1911, without telling the commission members how the plan had been developed, a final report along the legislative text went to Congress a year later with a few minor changes. This is naturally the National Reserve Association that we have. So scientific in its method, and democratic in its control. The banks couldn't control the U.S. money under the old system. This is why they created the reserve system and why they created a fiat currency in which they can control the U.S. money supply and ensure their wealth. Fiat money is the key here because
right.
fiat money is created by the banks.
Same sentence.
Right. So I'd like to bring up slides on fiat currency, which is essentially a human invention, and we all know humans ain't perfect. So what exactly is fiat money in the first place, and is it worth anything? Well, let's say that your debt is fake and your money is faked, because I'd like to bring up this quote in the fact that the reality of how money is created today differs from the descriptions found in some economics textbooks. Rather than banks receiving deposits when households save and then lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. Look at this chart right here, money creation in the U.S. Whatever bonds the other banks do not purchase, the Federal Reserve purchases. The Federal Reserve can exercise a power that the Treasury cannot. It can simply print money from nothing, but it creates this money as public debt, i.e. the government's liability to the Fed. This is exactly scenario number 3 in the previous slide. So now I'd like to go further into what fiat money is, and which essentially it's a currency which derives its value from the government regulation or law, basically meaning an IOU or the government's uh, the government's money. Money creation in the U.S. is also this, which the Federal Reserve function as legal tender or fiat money, and this money that we have essentially represents debt to the Fed. So U.S. coins, however, are produced by the U.S. Treasury, and they do not represent debt to private banks at all. So I'd like to bring up this very stark differences between the dollar before and the dollar today. This is money on the top. However, the dollar we have today is debt. What's in your wallet? Even more differences. And here we can see that the origins of the Federal Reserve is economic stability concerns. The gold standard as an alternative to a central bank was essentially this. The value of the currency is fixed in its terms of the quantity of gold, and it sets the money supply and price level generally with limited central bank intervention. This is why they could not use the type of money they had today before they created the Federal Reserve. Now I'd like to bring up this very interesting chart in which it's the purchasing power of the US dollar from 1913 to 2013. Now, in 1913, the Federal Reserve is created, which already immediately, you can see in a 10-year time span, halves the dollar's value in half. As you can see, it's steadily rising until about 1933, where FDR's executive order makes it illegal to hold gold coin, bullion, or certificates. Then it drops to 1944, where Bretton Woods establishes the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And finally, onto 1971, Nixon closes the gold window, which is the end of Bretton Woods and beginning of the modern-day fiat currency. Before 1913, we had little or no national debt. Let's look at the chart representing the total U.S. debt percent of gross domestic product. As you can see, it's very much rising, and it is still rising today. Because in 1964, the minimum wage was only 5 silver quarters, and in 2016, that's the equivalent of $15.55. We don't need to raise the minimum wage. We need to fix the money. But what is fiat money again? I'd like to emphasize that it is legalized government money. But now I'd like to bring the disease of fiat money, which is inflation. So what do other people say about the Federal Reserve? Well, Woodrow Wilson said this: a great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is privately concentrated, which means that the growth of the nation and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men, i.e. the deep state that controls everything with the Federal Reserve and the fiat currency. Another quote from Thomas Jefferson is this, that I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless and on the continent their fathers conquered. So this is a very early quote, even warning that banks would be dangerous as they are now today. And finally, a quote from Ludwig von Mises, in which he says that the gold standard did not collapse. Governments abolished it in order to pave the way for inflation. These people have very specific quotes that can be said about the banking system we have today, and that can be hinted of why the deep state wanted that fiat currency in the first place. Because war, who is it good for? It isn't good for anybody except for the deep state who funds the military-industrial complex. They get funds from oil, funds from bank, and they go to fund the military-industrial complex, which in turn funds more money for the deep state, for the pockets themselves. Now I'd like to bring up a quote from Congress Lewis T. McFadden, in which he said, "Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board, a government board, has cheated the government of the United States and the people of the United States out of money to pay the national debt." This is what the deep state is doing. They are only doing these things, making debt, controlling the education systems and controlling medicine only for their own pleasure and for their own gain. Because the bankers lied. Since the truth is so simple, it is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I would believe that there would be a revolution before morning. A quote by Henry Ford, one of the world's leading. Now, the bankers lied about the nature of the Federal Reserve, because no money trust, says Morgan Firm. And America was established not to create wealth, but to realize a vision, to realize an ideal, to discover and maintain liberty among men. Or was it? These two notes is essentially the dollar we have today and monopoly money. Is your belief that one has more value than the other? Now let's look at from official monopoly rules. The bank never goes broke, because if the bank runs out of money, the banker may issue as much more as may be needed by writing on any ordinary paper, essentially meaning that the ordinary paper you use in monopoly is worth the money in the game itself. Now I'd like to bring this very political slide here, which you can see here. So how many will have to die so we can force our little Ponzi scheme on the rest of the world? A couple 100 million. Not bad at all. That's essentially what I think of the Federal Reserve Board in 1917. And now regarding the central bank's debt-based fiat money scam, the few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class. So they killed to establish the Federal Reserve Bank, and they lied to keep it going. Why wouldn't they kill it to keep it safe? Now the deep state takes back what they believe belongs to them. Because ever wonder why large oil companies are not worried about running out of oil? Well, the answer is easy, because they know better. They are not running out and will never run out. So this is essentially how the deep state got its first deep pockets in the first place with the Standard Oil Company, which is essentially a monopoly, and it's also based on a fraud as well. Because we are taught this kind of science in schools today, and still if you search up how oil is made, you are still looking up into how this diagram fits that description. Because how oil is actually made is not from dinosaurs at all. It's made from the magma layer, which is oil migrating into those oil reserves that we mine up ourselves. The deep state wanted us to believe we were running out of oil, but we are not running out of oil at all. This very early quote said that between 1965 and 1970, the oil will peak and decline steadily thereafter. But how do you run out of a naturally occurring substance in the first place? How will top oil producers perform in 2017? And remember, according to peak oil, we would be out of oil by now, not leading the world in production. Wake up, America. The origins of oil. Instead of less oil, we have more. We're not running out at all, because look at this weekly U.S. crude oil production. It skyrockets into today's time. Instead of producing less oil, we have produced more oil than ever before. And again, another chart and saying that oil is naturally occurring and we don't have to import it at all, because this oil production proves that. If we were running out of oil, why would be gathering more than before? All of those wars that were fought over oil, this is the deep state's doing. This is the shadow government. The unelected deep state is here to stay. No blood for oil. They bring little to help you or your family. This is an endless war caused by the deep state. Now let's look at depletion. It's used to indicate the decrease in the value of the resource base when natural resources are being consumed in producing products or services. The term is most commonly used in connection with mining properties, oil and gas wells, and the amounts charged as depletion cannot be used to replace sold resources. So now let's look at the oil depletion allowance. The 1963 tax bill removes loopholes favoring oil companies. Kennedy was still proposing tax reform legislation bills to close tax loopholes. Those were their loopholes he was talking about. In particular, there was the oil depletion allowance. Although Kennedy planned ostensibly kept the rate of the allowance 27.5%, the oilmen's attorneys analyzing the measure had concluded that changes proposed by the administration in the tax code would cut the effective rate to 17.5%. To the rest of the world, such a reduction would be only justice, or at least the beginning of justice. To the oilmen, it was robbery. Now, here's a quote from Harry S. Truman, in which he says, "I know of no loophole in tax laws so inequitable as the excessive depletion exemptions now enjoyed by oil and mining interests. This is a shocking example of how present tax loopholes permit a few to gain enormous wealth without paying their fair share of taxes." So what we have here is the government seeking oil, but how the deep state runs the country is through these major things. 1, through education, 2, through medicine, and 3, through banks. We already know how they run the country, through banks, but let's look at education and medicine. All these 3 things are there to control the person and to control the people, because without knowing at all what you Without knowing at all what you are being taught, you are assuming that what you're being taught is material and is the only thing that you should be concerned with. Then let's look at a quote with John D. Rockefeller, in which he says that I always try to turn every disaster into an opportunity. But why would the founder of such a large company say that in the first place? Well, could he be telling the truth? Well, let's look at these 10 disasters. 1, the Titanic disaster. 2, World War I. 3, the stock market crash. 4, Pearl Harbor. 5, the JFK assassination. The Vietnam War, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Clinton, and 9/11. All of these disasters happened, but who could possibly profit from all of these disasters? Well, that's simple. The deep state had made those disasters happen and did profit off of them. Now let's look at an FDR letter to the King of Saudi Arabia in order to further corroborate most of these disasters. So, great and good friend, I have received the communication with your majesty sent me under the date of March 10th, 1945, in which you refer to the question of Palestine and to the continuing interest of the Arabs in current developments affecting that country. I am gratified that your majesty took this occasion to bring your views on this question to my attention, and I have given the most careful attention to the statements which you make in your letter. I am also mindful the memorable conversation of which we had not so long ago, and it gives me pleasure to renew your majesty the assurances which you have previously received regarding the attitude of my government. Essentially, what this means is it adds on to the fact that a no-go for the U.S. to recognize Israel as a state is how the president wanted it to be. But as you can see from earlier presentations, there was a quick 180 when FDR did eventually die. The bankers wanted Israel to become a state, and the U.S. would help recognize it in the first place. All of these could be called coincidences, but they are part of the deep state's plan. 1 week later, FDR is dead. This is not a coincidence. Put it this way, if you kill a dying man, few questions are asked, and 20 years later, it happens again. Well, FDR murdered? Well, look at these headlines. The president died suddenly, and he had health problems hid from the public, and it's easy to kill a dying man. Is this JFK murdered by a plot? Well, handbills were passed out in Dallas on November 21, 1963.
Lance,
Yes.
Just a quick point on FDR. Now, Fletcher Prouty, he talked to Elliott Roosevelt, and who talked to Stalin, and Stalin was convinced that FDR was poisoned.
Absolutely. And from the previous presentations, we do have those connections of him being poisoned and him being very sick. And eventually that is how they could have done it. And I presented in my previous presentation at the Yalta conference is when he was poisoned. That's when he started to become sick. So let's look further into the 2 ways to compute depletion allowance. Let's go back to the oil, which is how they get their money. The percentage method is based on percentage of year's gross income, provided amount charged does not exceed 50% of net income. So this can be used for most types of metal mines, but it cannot be used for timber, and in most cases is not applicable to oil and gas. So now let's look at the oil depletion allowance history. In 1960, the petroleum industry takes off as Americans' love affair with the automobile begins. In 1926, Congress approves the depletion allowance, which lets oil producers deduct more than a quarter of their gross revenues. In 1937, Treasury Secretary Henry McArthur calls the depletion allowance perhaps the most glaring loophole in the tax code. President Franklin D. Roosevelt urges Congress to close it, and other tax evasion methods so widespread and so amazing, both in their boldness and their ingenuity, that further action without delay seems imperative. And in 1947, natural gas drillers in Kansas first experiment with hydraulic farming or fracking, but the technology won't be widely used until the federal government backs its development in the 70s. And in 1950, President Harry S. Truman unsuccessfully prods Congress to end the depletion allowance. And going further into this, in 1957, they asked about the depletion allowance, in which President Dwight Eisenhower replies, I am not prepared to say it is evil, because while we do find, I assume that a number of rich men take advantage of it unfairly. There must be certainly an incentive in this country if we're going to continue the exploration for gas and oil that is so important to our economy. And in 1960, President candidates John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon debate the depletion allowance. Kennedy says he's willing to review and close the loophole once and for all. And in 1969, Congress cuts the depletion allowance deduction from 27.5 to 23% over the objections of the president of Gulf Oil, who calls it a cornerstone, a major part of the foundation on which industry has built its house. President Nixon says the tax break is in the national interest because Mid-East oil supplies could be cut off in the event of a world conflict. And now, nearing our time in 1974 with the OPEC oil embargo and energy crisis at full tilt, Nixon vows to do everything in his power to prevent the big oil companies and other major energy producers from making an unconscionable profit out of this crisis. And in 1975, Ford almost vetoes, but then signs a tax bill, then repeals the depletion allowance for a large company. In 1975 to 77, the Department of Energy oversees the first successful applications of large-scale fracking to extract oil and gas. And finally, in 77, President Jimmy Carter praises Senator Russell Long of oil-rich Louisiana for voting to do away with the oil depletion allowance, which was a very courageous thing to do. So as oil prices rise, oil depletion allowance is not needed to make windfall profits anymore. Now, as we conclude on that, let's look into this first part of how the deep state controls the people, education. So why Rockefeller got involved with education is a very important thing to note when looking into the deep state. Because in the early 20th century, J.D. Rockefeller Education Foundation got involved in giving large grants in which they spent millions of dollars of money, which was used to radically bend the traditionalist education system toward a new system that favored standardizing testing over critical thinking, towards scientific management in schools. This was part of a calculated plan to make the schooling system benefit corporate America at the expense of the American school child. What was this for? Now let's look at a direct quote from the man himself. "I don't want a nation of thinkers. I want a nation of workers." It was found out in a congressional investigation that the only way to maintain control of the U.S. population was to obtain control of education in the United States. They realized this was a prodigious task, so the Carnegie Foundation approached the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that they go in tandem and that the portion of education which could be considered as domestically oriented be taken over by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which was oriented to the international matters be taken over by the Carnegie Endowment. Essentially, we have the two major players in the deep state and in the economy having these education systems set up for future generations. Now, the GEB influences the school agenda too, because this was established in 1903 by John D. Rockefeller, and its broad charter was to sponsor and support aid to education in the United States without distinction of race, sex, or creed. The influential figure in the creation and scope of the General Education Board was Frederick T. Gates, longtime philanthropic advisor to John D. Rockefeller. So, foremost amongst its early initiatives was to promote the establishment of public high schools in southern states. It did so by means of direct grants and also by assembling teams of experts in planning and development so as to create within these states public and legislative support for extending public schooling to include high school as a part of a permanent system funded by regular taxation. So the new schools, again, were not for critical thinking. The General Education Board was not interested in encouraging critical thinking. Rather, its focus was on organizing children and creating reliable, predictable, and obedient citizens. As award-winning former teacher John Gatto puts it, school was looked upon from the first part of the 20th century as a branch of industry and a tool of governance. The Rockefellers, along with the other financial elite and their philanthropic organization, have been able to mold society by funding and pushing compulsory state schooling for the masses. And furthermore, in our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with the perfect docility to our molding hand, essentially corroborating that statement of the Rockefeller Foundation. And even a quote from himself, John D. Rockefeller, "Good leadership consists of showing average people how to do the work of superior people." He himself knows that he's doing this. Now, concluding on education, I would like to bring in the last factor into how the deep state controls the American people: medicine. So turning black gold into medicine, petroleum drugs. Let's go back in time in the late 1800s where John D. Rockefeller, a man quoted to have said competition is sin, is the head of the Rockefeller family and has just become very rich through extracting oil from the ground. Now he is looking for ways to capitalize even further with his oil, and he comes across the idea of using coal tar, a petroleum derivative, to make substances that affect the human mind, body, and nervous system. These are called drugs, and they are excellent at masking or stopping symptoms, but overall do not cure the underlying cause of disease. And even he says himself, I have ways of making money that you know nothing of. So he's buying out the IG Farben, in which he uses his oil money to do so. This was the very same cartel that would later assist Hitler to implement his eugenics-based vision of a new world order founded on racial supremacy. Now, this may seem out of reach, but it's very peculiar that he bought this out, which funded Hitler by manufacturing chemicals and poisons for war. With the control of drug manufacturing under his wings, Rockefeller then embarked on a decidedly wicked plan, wicked from the point of view of a free and healthy humanity, but brilliant from a business perspective, which we have the major connections here. So destroying competition just like oil. Rockefeller saw that there were many types of doctors and healing modalities in existence at that time, from chiropractic to naturopathy to homeopathy to holistic medicine to herbal medicine and more. He wanted to eliminate the competitors of Western medicine, which the only modality which would propose drugs and radiation as treatment, thus enriching Rockefeller, who owned the means to produce these treatments. So he hired a man called Abraham Flexner to submit a report to Congress in 1910. This report concluded that there were too many doctors and medical schools in America, and that all the natural healing modalities which had existed for hundreds or thousands of years were unscientific quackery. It called for the standardization of medical education, whereby only the allopathic case-based be allowed to grant medical schools license in the U.S. So Rockefeller played hardball with people's lives. Medical schools that offered courses in bioelectric medicine, homeopathy, or Eastern medicine, for example, were told to either drop these courses from the curriculum or lose their accreditation and underwriting support. A few schools resisted for a time, but eventually most schools cooperated or were closed down. Now, here's the timeline I would like to present for Rockefeller's medical control. On 1911, May 15, the Supreme Court of the U.S. finds John Rockefeller and his trust guilty of corruption, illegal business practices, and racketeering. As a result of this decision, the entire Rockefeller Standard Oil Trust, the world's largest corporation of its time, was sentenced to be dismantled. But he was already above the Supreme Court and did not care about this decision. Now, further on that, how philanthropy became monopoly is essentially the same game. In 1913, in order to disperse public and political pressure on him and other robber barons, Rockefeller uses a trick called philanthropy, whereby the illegal gains from his robber practices in the oil businesses are used to launch the Rockefeller Foundation. This tax haven was used to strategically take over the healthcare sector of the U.S. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation was the front organization for a new global business venture of Rockefeller and his accomplices. This new venture was called the Pharmaceutical Investment Business. Donations from the Rockefeller Foundation went only to medical schools and hospitals. These institutions had become missionaries of a new breed of companies, the manufacturers of patented synthetic drugs. Rockefeller medicine men and more political cartoons on how he has made the medicine today. Now, the pharmaceutical industry does not create cures. They create customers because they never create cures. They just keep having you on this type of medicine. And Paul A. Phillips, Big Pharma Profits Over People 8 Examples, and the truth about the drug companies, how they deceive us, and what to do about it. All of these things tie in with how the deep state is run, with how they control the U.S. people. Because this is, again, like oil game. How big oil conquered the world? Well, he's going to do it through medicine as well. Sherman Antitrust Act, which was made illegal to form the trust that interfered with free trade between states or other countries, he just goes and does it anyway. Ohio Attorney General David K. Watson took on Standard Oil for being a monopoly. This is essentially the chart that we have and how they separate it into these very separate things, but they're all from the same Standard Oil company. However, what if the splits never really took place? Well, I'd like to bring a quote from Ida Tarbell, in which she says, Rockefeller and his associates do not build the Standard Oil Company in the boardrooms of Wall Street banks. They fought their way to control by rebate and drawback, bribe and blackmail, espionage, and price cutting by ruthless efficiency of organization. Tarbell portrayed John D. Rockefeller as bad-tempered, stingy, money-grabbing, and viciously effective at monopolizing the oil trade and destroying small businesses, as you can see from here in McClure's magazine. The history of the Standard Oil Company is featured in this magazine, of which they even say that the Supreme Court orders dissolution of Standard Oil Company, declaring it monopoly and restraint of trade. But they already declared a monopoly since but he keeps on doing his thing anyway in the deep state. Standard Oil an illegal trust and must be dissolved. Again, he ignores the court order. Standard Oil was established by this deep state person, and he approached mergers differently. They joined with competing companies in trust agreements. Participant in a trust turned their stock over to a group of trustees, people who ran the separate companies, one large corporation. Now, what strategies enabled big businesses to eliminate competition? Well, they formed partnerships to create monopolies. They merged small companies into large corporations, and they aimed for total control of an industry so that they could fix prices and wages to their advantage. Another direct quote from John D. Rockefeller: next to doing the right thing, the most important thing is to let people know you are doing the right thing. Well, let's see. He did exactly that. He told the public this: one, that oil was a fossil fuel when he owned 90% of the oil, and two, this made the product scarce and increased his profit. Again, he told the public that one, natural medicine was bad and you should use modern medicine, and two, modern medicine was guided by his oil, his financial wealth, and he made money off of both. These things are important because he told us that we should all go to public education. Two, that he told us that we should all take classes. And three, he told us that we should have standardized tests, teach to the middle, and make everyone smart enough to become good workers and not question society. And again, a quote by Charles Lindbergh: under the Federal Reserve Act, panics are scientifically created. The present panic is the first scientifically created one, worked out as we figure a mathematical question. And bringing up his previous quotes again, this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. But furthermore, the new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. Essentially, the trust can get another period of inflation, and they figure they can unload the stocks on the people at high prices during the excitement, but then they can make the prices go back down. The people may not know immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. No matter how paranoid or conspiracy-minded you are, what the government is doing is worse than you imagine. And a final quote from Woodrow Wilson: I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and juris of a small group of dominant men. 1913 is the worst year ever, because that's essentially when they got legalized way to have their power over the people. And the U.S. Supreme Court that decided that big case. Well, now let's look at how you have all these things happening. 1, endless wars. 2, gasoline shortages when it is unlimited. 3, education when there is none to be had. And finally, 4, medicine that causes you to become addicted and not cured. All of this was carefully planned and heavily orchestrated by the deep state. Now apply this to the Kennedy assassination. Was big oil involved? Well, let's look at that. In Pravda 2007, a direct quote, many experts in America believe that the conspiracy in Dallas was organized by a group of billionaires from Texas with Harold Hunt at head. The man was considered the world's richest man of that time. The Texas businessman took an active part in the political life of America, and he nominated Texas Senator Lyndon Johnson for presidential election in 1960. The first attempt to promote Johnson was a failure, but Hunt finished the game in Dallas, as a result of which Kennedy was killed and his candidate came to the White House. So who is H.L. Hunt? Well, let's look at his quotes. Money is just a way of keeping score. And he said that I didn't go to high school and I didn't go to grade school either, because education, I think, is refinement, and it is probably a liability. And more on that, decide what you want, decide what you are willing to exchange, and establish your priorities and go to work. And that there are only 3 requirements for success. First, decide exactly what it is you want in life. Second, determine the price that you are going to have to pay and the things you want. And third, that this is the most important resolve to pay that price. Welcome, Mr. Kennedy, to Dallas. This is how they got Mr. Kennedy killed. This is how the deep state orchestrated so Lyndon would be the one in this place. And now let's put the pieces together. An oil man drills a well that costs $100,000. He finds a reservoir containing $10 million worth of oil. The well produces $1 million worth of oil per year for 10 years. And in the very first year, thanks to the depletion allowance, the oil man could deduct 27.5% or $275,000 of that $1 million in income from his taxable income. Thus, in just 1 year, he deducted nearly 3 times his initial investment, but the depletion allowance continues to pay off. For each of the next 9 years, he gets to continue taking the $275,000 depletion deduction. By the end of the 10th year, the oil man has $2.75 million from his taxable income. Such a system that was clearly unfair and only benefited a small group of businessmen in Texas. It seemed only a matter of time before Congress removed this tax loophole. However, these oil men used some of their great wealth to manipulate the politicians in Washington, especially LBJ. Now add to the fact that oil can be used basically tax-free, never runs out, and Americans are duped and paying through the nose for it. The oil men would have a great deal to lose. The banks, the military industrial complex, and big oil are one. In September of 2003, George W. Bush asked the U.S. Congress to approve an $87 billion spending package to pay for the war and for reconstruction efforts in Iraq. Not surprisingly, a big chunk of that money was going to Dick Cheney's old company, Halliburton. When Bush went to Congress, Halliburton had already been paid about $2 billion for its work in Iraq. The company had 4,500 people on its payroll, though it was hard to tell the Halliburton employees from the U.S. military. Some were working at oil installations like Mina Baker. Others were delivering mail to U.S. troops. Others were cooking meals, doing laundry, and building military bases. Like the soldiers, Halliburton employees were dying. By January 2004, more than a dozen Halliburton workers or subcontractors had been killed while carrying out their duties in Iraq. For his part, Dick Cheney went on television in September of 2003 to defend his ongoing payments from Halliburton. Cheney insisted that he had no financial interest in that company of any kind. This was incorrect. When Cheney made that statement, he still had options on about 433,000 shares of Halliburton stock. He was also in the second year of a 5-year deferred compensation deal with Halliburton. In 2002, Cheney received deferred compensation payments from Halliburton that totaled $162,000 and $392. That sum was on top of the $205,298 in deferred compensation that Cheney received in 2001, as well as his annual salary of about $200,000. So Cheney also defended his old employer, saying he had no idea why Halliburton got the no-bid oil field repair contract, but he did say that there are a few companies out there that have the combination of the very large engineering construction capability and significant oil field services. So in Iraq, the U.S. government, the military, corporate America, and the oil businesses, all of these things became one. Of course, the politicians do the bidding of the deep state, because on March 25th, 2003, 5 days after the Navy SEALs stormed aboard the Mina al-Baker oil terminal to start the Second Iraq War, the former president gave a speech at the Marriott River Center Hotel in San Antonio. His audience The National Petrochemical and Refiners Association. Bush Sr. was a little peeved, not at his allies in the oil and chemical industry, of course. The National Petrochemical and the Refiners Association, a group whose membership includes virtually all U.S. refiners and petrochemical manufacturers, was a friendly audience. He was angry at those misguided protesters who were staging huge anti-war rallies all over the country. Those demonstrators had gotten under Bush's skin, and he was particularly inflamed by the signs that the demonstrators were carrying that said "No War for Oil." Bush said he'd seen similar protests and similar signs prior to the first Iraq War, and now that the second Iraq War was underway, he was still contending that the protesters were mistaken. This is not about oil, he told the refiners. As you can see, this is the deep state's doing. If you want to know who killed Kennedy, ask who has the power to reroute the presidential motorcade and ignore standard operating procedures and cover it up. Why was Kennedy shot? Who benefited? And who has the power to cover it up? Also on 9/11, who had the power to turn off the air defenses? The deep state had all of this power. Even himself, he said that I will splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. And very peculiar here, the government planned execution of the JFK Kennedy, but who is next? The plot to scapegoat Russia, all of these things the deep state has controlled. And now I'd like to bring these three quotes from very different perspectives. The reason that the American army does so well in wartime is that the war is chaos, and the American army practices chaos on a daily basis. And from a Soviet document, one of the serious problems in planning against American doctrine is that the Americans do not read their manuals, nor do they feel any obligations to follow their doctrine. And finally, an anonymous quote, if we don't know what we are doing, the enemy certainly can't anticipate our future actions. John F. Kennedy and Muammar Gaddafi were both killed by the deep state. As you can see, all of these conspiracies add up. The deep throat Bush, the coup d'etat in slow motion, all of these things, how JFK was killed. The deep state has done all of this. And another final quote from Woodrow Wilson himself. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. So we have the deep state covering all the JFK files and covering all conspiracies ever since they got the power back in 1913 of the Federal Reserve. Eisenhower's farewell sees threat to liberties and vast defense machine. And a final quote from John F. Kennedy, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. These words right here in his inauguration killed him. The deep state wanted people dependent. The deep state wanted groups dependent. They wanted poor schools, bad medicine, endless wars, and the deep state doesn't want you to know it because you are a danger to their society. What made President Kennedy great was his attacks on the deep state. What cost President JFK had to do was also the same. This is essentially a government versus deep state going on here. How JFK had attacked the deep state, but how he was killed for it was essentially this. The deep state was all to blame. And even so, members of the deep state themselves, they investigate themselves because not only do they not know everyone in the deep state, but they are also being controlled. All of these people who were in charge of the multiple investigations, they were all people in the deep state, but they were also being controlled by one another. CIA, George Bush, Dealey Plaza coordinator, all of these were part of the deep state. And even the many faces of Lee Harvey Oswald is from that. So now let's look at a final organizational chart for the deep state. This is the deep state elite I'd like to share. The bankers are the Mega Wealth International, in which they have all of these things, the big business, the big oil, big pharma, and big ag. Now they also have the military-industrial complex, NSA, CIA, FBI, political leaders, labor leaders, the mafia, organized crime, and finally political bosses, government employees, and educational leaders. All of these companies and people were out to get JFK because of his attacks on their deep state organization. I'd like to conclude that JFK was killed by this very same thing, the deep state. What is the deep state? Well, it controls our lives.
Wow, that was sensational, Lance. You can drop the screen share. I just thought you did a sensational job. I'm sure everyone else feels the same. Don, would you like to comment for openers?
Okay, well, there's obviously a lot there. Okay, so, as we've talked about on previous shows, okay, let's start with the Federal Reserve, because you can't do anything without money. Okay.
Yes.
And who controls the money supply? So he hit on it there. The Federal Reserve came into being. Yes, yeah, it's. So who owns it? So back to my one of my favorite articles. Yeah, the Federal Reserve Cartel, the 8 Families by Dean Henderson. We see who owns the Federal Reserve. So one Saudi banker cited 80% ownership of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, which is the New York Fed is the most powerful branch, and it was owned by just 8 families, 4 of which reside in the U.S. They are Goldman Sachs, the Rockefellers, the Lehmans and Kuhn Loebs of New York, the Rothschilds of Paris and London, the Warburgs of Hamburg, the Lazards of Paris, and the Israel Moses Sefs of Rome. They're all Jewish. Okay, so we've got a central bank. And if you look at the Communist Manifesto, I put the link in the chat there if anybody wants to check it out. Okay, the number 5 plank in the Communist Manifesto is centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So that's the Federal Reserve System. That fits that to a T. What else is in the Communist Manifesto? Okay, number 1 plank is abolish private property. Okay, well, they haven't got all the way there yet, but they're on their way to it. 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, check. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. They're working on that. Confiscation of all property.
See, Don. The estate tax is a right of inheritance. I think you're mixing some things here. I think Lance has got it right, and the Communist Manifesto is warping it. That's my take here, because it's really not as straightforward as you're suggesting. I think you make a lot of great points, but I think that you are misreading the man.
What I'm saying is the deep state is communist, and it's creeping in. And the first plank of that was 1913.
I think the deep state is fascist. It's a merger of big government with big business. As Mussolini himself said was the definition of fascism. It can equally well be defined as corporatism. There's an egalitarian aspect and a communitarian aspect to communism that isn't present in what we're dealing with here, which is domination by corporations from the top down.
These corporations are all owned by the same Jewish bankers. I mean, who funded the Bolshevik Revolution? It was Schiff of New York. It was the Schiffs and the Rothschilds that funded the Bolshevik Revolution.
Okay, those are all valuable comments. Larry, how would you like to comment on Lance?
Oh, I think Lance better be careful. I think they might have opened a dossier on him over at Langley.
Tonight.
Yeah.
Lance, it was just sensational, fella. You did a great job. For someone of your age, I'm just blown away, okay? Absolutely fantastic.
But seriously, there's so many elements, in his presentation. Obviously, the military-industrial complex, the big oil and everything, Federal Reserve, the bankers and everything. And this is sort of like so many forces against JFK. And but still, I'd like to go back to, I mentioned this in my book, that the concept that JFK wanted peace, above anything else. And his American University speech, June of 1963, is pivotal because that brings all of these entities together, Jim. So that's just I think that's the glue that holds all these entities together.
The National Security Act of 46.
Yeah, well, when he said peace, in that commencement speech, at the American University, and he mentioned peace at least 50 times. You know?
Yeah.
So
Right. There's absolutely no probability.
Peace being the antithesis of war.
of course.
Gary, what would you like to add?
I'd like to say that I think we're in good hands with Lance and his crew. He's got several researchers that work with him. Would you like to introduce any of the other ones that work with you, Lance? Wasn't there a girl that worked with you the last time? I forgot her name.
Her name was Madison, and unfortunately, they can't be here today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a big group working with you, and you're trying to spread it out. All right. Be careful. Don't put it on YouTube because you'll be gone in a flash. No doubt about it.
Right.
So that's really all I wanted to add about it.
What was our timing like, Gary? I have no idea.
I see it. We got about that much left. I say 5.
I mean, he covered this in less than an hour.
Yeah. Lance was tearing it
talking
up.
fast, yeah.
Now, Lance, I'll just say stylistically, I mean, I have the same tendency, but you were talking a mile a minute.
Right.
Very difficult to follow when you talk so fast. You had so much material to deliver. Now, I think if you'd stretched it to about an hour by slowing down your rate of delivery, that would have been an improvement. I mean, look, you got masterful content. You've done a brilliant job of analysis. Your overall thesis hangs together very, very well. It's appropriately corroborated and supported by your evidence. But your delivery was too fast, too intense. It's not surprising under these circumstances when you're coming in to this particular group to give this presentation. It is a first opportunity to do that. So this is advice for the future.
How many slides did you have, Lance? How many slides?
I had about 193 slides.
Yeah, well, I'll do a full show with like 15, you know.
Yeah. So I think we covered like 5 shows in one.
There's some absolutely wonderful slides there too, Lance.
Yeah,
It's a really terrific slide.
Last month in Washington, I had, I think, what was 88 or something like that, and I was going just as fast, you know. So,
yeah.
and
there is one thing I wanted to say, Lance. If you remember, we had a mock trial that Larry Rivera was supposed to be involved in, and then they removed him from the case. I've always said that if they would have just sent you down there, that's all they'd had to do in 1 hour.
I want to ask Lance, you know, what do his fellow classmates think about all of this? I think it's pretty relevant because, and how many are interested in this type of research? You know, yeah.
Right. Well, for now, haven't seen much of my classmates watching some of the videos we've been recording, but the classmates that I do know of, they very much appreciate some of the conversation pieces that I've presented to them, but it also makes them think about what they're doing in school and essentially why are they learning these types of things for their standardized tests.
Are they under pressure? Are they under any pressure from teachers or professors, you know, to not go this way?
Actually, a few of my friends are
encouraged, or are they encouraged? It's basically what I wanted to
a few of my friends are pressured into not thinking this kind of thing, but that's kind of obvious coming from their perspectives of the teachers. But most of the people I have talked to in my debate class and my debate coach, they very much appreciate this type of thinking and the way we are going.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good.
Just need to slightly slow down your delivery, Lance, ever so slightly. It'll seem like a lot to you, but it'll make a big difference to the audience. So, but
that's a lot of slides, Jim. That's
yeah. I mean, yeah, obviously you had to move very, very fast to cover that staggering number of slides.
That was about 10 years worth of research in 1 hour.
I think for the number of slides you have, I would take 2 hours, see, and you were doing it in like 45 minutes.
Yeah, if you average that out, you're talking about a slide every 30 seconds.
No, it's less than that. It's less than that.
Yeah.
I bet it's less than that. So, all right, fellas, I guess we have a show under the belt, don't you?
Hey, I got a parting shot for you guys.
Okay.
All right, so again, it wouldn't be a JFK show with me on it if we didn't talk about the protocols. So from Protocol 3 real quick, We support communism. The people under our guidance have annihilated the aristocracy, who are their one and only defense and foster mother for the sake of their own advantage, which is inseparably bound up with the well-being of the people. Nowadays, with the destruction of the aristocracy, the people have fallen into the grips of the merciless money-grinding scoundrels who have laid a pitiless and cruel yoke upon the necks of the workers. And the Federal Reserve is communist.
I love it, Don. I love it. I love it. Lance, you were sensational.
My last
Loved
parting
it. We're going to share this with Mike and with others.
My last parting shot, Jay. My last parting shot. Dave Garrity and I just finally finished the book tonight, and it's going to be on Moonrock Books and Patriot Radio Books or whatever. Gary, what's the site that you have?
Patriot Radio Books, but
Patriot Radio Books.
I sent my whole email subscription list to you just so y'all could hurry up and buy them because they didn't have them in stock.
Yeah, but they'll be in stock next week, and it's an amazing. We all know how many years we've been working on this.
Oh yeah,
and,
A Lifetime of Research by Larry Rivera.
Yeah,
Got it. All right, fellas, we're gonna ring the bell. We're out of here. This is JFK Show number 189. Lance, we salute you and your generation. Thank you very much to the new generation researchers. We'll see everyone next week.
All right.